Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists, Michele Glass here. Welcome back to another chapter 12 video, and we're going to focus here on that neuron specifically. The neuron, remember, is our smallest functional unit of the entire nervous system. So it's the cell doing the communicating, meaning collecting data, processing, integrating that information, and then directing the responses out in the body. So our nervous system is composed of trillions of neurons, so it does make sense for us to talk about these just a little bit more detailed. So I'm going to list out for you some structures, and then we'll do a nice little drawing, and then we'll revisit those different types of neurons that we've mentioned already in our previous videos. So to start with, we're going to have this structure that's called the soma. And the soma can also be referred to as the cell body. The soma is going to contain the nucleus and other organelles. And what we'll see as part of these other organelles, we have what's called bodies, which is a large collection of rough endoplasmic reticulum, which we can abbreviate as rough ER. The bodies actually contribute to the gray color that we see in gray matter. So we mentioned already, anywhere that we have gray matter in the nervous system, we have a collection of soma or cell bodies. And those cell bodies, let's go back up here. Let's describe them as having the job of processing information or integrating information. Oh, I'm just going to call them processors. As we continue thinking about our neuron, we see that in addition to the cell body, there's going to be cellular extensions. And so let's talk first about the dendrite, which is a cellular extension, brings information to the soma. So the dendrite is a cellular extension that's bringing information to the soma. We can also say that it's receiving signals at a synapse. So what we're seeing is that other cells are synapsing directly onto the dendrite, and then that information collectively is coming into the soma. The soma then is integrating those signals, processing that information. And then the other key extension that we see is the axon. And so this is the cellular extension that takes information away from the cell body or the soma toward, we're going to call it the target cell. And the target cell is the cell that we're synapsing with. So it could be a muscle cell, and the muscle cell could be cardiac, smooth, or skeletal muscle. It could be a gland. As we've already mentioned, we can be synapsing onto glands. It could be adipose tissue, and it could also be another neuron. So we'll see that our neurons are also connecting with neurons. So we're taking information away from the soma. We can also talk about the axon as propagating the action potential. So we use this term propagate before in chapter 10. We talked about it as sort of like that signal traveling, if you wanted to think about it in that sense. Now the axon has several special regions. So we have what's called the axon hillock. This is the initial segment. This is where the action potential starts. This is also where we start to see exoplasm, which is a more limited version of cytoplasm. So once we get to the axon hillock and then the rest of the axon, we're going to talk about the cytoplasm as exoplasm. Okay. we'll see that the axon can be myelinated. So especially if we're talking about an axon in the peripheral nervous system, all of those axons will be myelinated. We'll see that myelination is pretty predominant in the spinal cord. And then in the brain, where the neurons are very close to each other, they may or may not have myelination. So the myelination we can think about as an insulation. It's a wrapper around the axon. When we talk about it being an insulator, is helping to speed up action potential propagation. So it's important in the rate of how that signal is propagated or moving along. It's going to be formed by a group of cells called oligodendrocytes or Schwann cells, which is capitalized, it's named after a person. Both oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells are going to be examples of glial cells. So we'll talk about them more in just a little bit. Now, when we talk about the axon being myelinated, we'll see that it's like you get myelination and then none, myelination and then none, myelination and then none. So we'll see that in our picture in just a minute. So we will get what are called node of Ranviers. Is this exposed, unmyelinated axon section? And then you have what's described as an axon segment, which is the myelinated axon. And then we're also going to see two more things here dealing with the axon. So we also have what's called the axon terminal. Axon terminal is the end of the axon, and it can have several branches. And the very end of the axon terminal is the synaptic. I'm going to call it knob because that's the terminology I've been using. In OpenStax, they talk about it as the synaptic end bulb. And this is going to be full of vesicles of neurotransmitter. So we focused in on this particular structure earlier. So we have the soma as the cell body. We have the dendrite as a cellular extension, receiving signal. We have the axon as a cellular extension, taking the signal to the next cell in line. Several important structures of the axon. We talked about the axon hillock as that initial segment. We started introducing this idea of myelination, where you have this sort of insulation that speeds up the rate of the transmission or rate of propagation. When we look at the myelinated axon, we see that it has what are described as exposed axon, the node of Ranvier, and then the myelinated axon, which is the axon segment. And the very end of our axon, we're getting into these axon terminals, which are several little branches, and then each of those branches ends in the synaptic knob, which is full of our neurotransmitter. So next, let's try to draw a picture. Okay, so let's try to draw a picture of our multipolar motor neuron, and let's begin with our cell body. So I'm just going to draw like a circle, and inside that circle, I'm going to draw a smaller circle and call that my nucleus. And then if I wanted to, I could draw the rough endoplasmic reticulum around the nucleus. So just kind of like back and forth lines and put the little dots to show the ribosome. This collection of rough ER, remember we can call that the nyso bodies. And that's going to give us that gray color that we're going to associate with the cell body. And we can call this structure here the soma or the cell body. And remember, you have all of your organelles that we learned about in chapter 3. Then let's start by drawing cell extensions. So let's actually begin by drawing our dendrites. And our dendrites are just kind of like branches of a tree coming off of the soma, branching and branching. So however you want to kind of represent those should be fine. Remember, the dendrite is how information is one way that information is being brought into the soma. So if you wanted to, you could draw an axon coming in, draw the axon terminal, which are those little branches, and then show that synaptic knob actually like synapsing onto the dendrite to show information coming into the dendrite, which is then going to translate to the soma. So I'm going to actually label this axon that I've drawn coming in a presynaptic neuron, meaning it's before the synapse. And I've shown that one in white. And so the neuron I'm drawing is in yellow. So I'm going to call my big neuron I'm drawing here my postsynaptic neuron. And then we need to draw our axon, our big extension coming off of our cell body. And so I'm going to make kind of like an enlarged place. So it's going to look a little bit like maybe a knob. And then I'm just going to make it a line. And to give myself space, I'm going to kind of curl my line around. Now, I said I drew like an enlarged space coming off of my cell body, and that was just really so I could label my axon hillock. And then remember, inside of that, we start to see the exoplasm, which is that special kind of limited cell cytoplasm that's inside the axon. And then my axon is what's coming off. So let me label that. Get my black back out for that. Okay. And so now what I want to do is I'm going to actually take white to help myself remember that white matter is called white because of the myelinated axons. And what I'm going to do is draw like a white cell, kind of oval shaped over a section of the axon and give space. And then draw another one and give space. Draw another one and give space. Draw another one and give space, and do that all the way down the axon, so that I'm left with these pieces of yellow line that are exposed and then yellow line that's colored in this kind of oval circle. So the oval circle is showing the myelin or myelination, right? And the section of axon, the section of axon that's inside, that piece is called the axon segment. And then the section of axon, and I'm going to point to several that are exposed, are described as the nodes of Renvier. Okay. When I get to the end of my axon that I've drawn, I'm going to show a few little branches. And so those little branches are my axon terminals. And then I'm going to do like a little bulbous ending, so a little oval circle on the ends to represent my synaptic knob. I'm going to change where I have that label. I'm going to also go ahead and draw a skeletal muscle fiber so I can tie together what I learned from like my chapter 10 with my chapter 12. So remember, our skeletal muscle fibers are cylindrical in shape. If you want to, you can show your striations. You can show your multinucleation in the cell. But the point here is just illustrating that that multipolar motor neuron is synapsing onto another cell, which it could be skeletal muscle. What I've drawn here could be a smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, gland, adipose tissue, or another neuron. So I'm trying to show this chain here. The other piece of information I want to highlight, and I'm going to keep my red, is that the signal might come from that presynaptic neuron that we drew up here, synapsing onto the dendrite. The signal then moves from the dendrite into the soma, and you might be getting signals from several of those dendrites being processed together. That signal then is going to reach the axon hillock, which is where the action potential starts, and then we'll see it jumping or moving along the axon until it reaches synaptic terminal in that synaptic knob. So an action potential is unidirectional, is going from the soma to the axon hillock to the axon. We could even add in it's going from the dendrite to the soma to the axon hillock to the axon, and then let's actually write synaptic knob. So I have that right here as part of my label. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. And so this will be important when we talk about action potentials being propagated, this unidirectional movement. Last tiny little piece of information is about those neuron types. So we actually did this a little bit already. So we're going to have a motor neuron. We're going to have a sensory neuron. And then we can kind of talk about an integration neuron. Now these would all be like functional descriptions. We can also look at our neuron types by shape. So we talked about the motor neuron as the multipolar neuron, and that's the one that we've been drawing where you have a cell body with a nucleus, you have several dendrites coming off. You can sort of make those look like tree branches, and then you have that one long axon ending in the axon terminal and the axon knob. So that's our multipolar neuron. And we're going to see this in our central nervous system, and we're going to see this in our efferent division, where efferent is talking about directing our effectors or our responses. We'll also see what's described as a bipolar neuron. So this one, we're going to have a dendrite, we're going to have a cell body in the middle, and then we're going to have an axon coming off. So to sort of represent the dendrite, you can make one end sort of look more like those tree branches. To represent your cell body, it's a circle with a nucleus. And then to represent your axon, draw your axon terminal with those synaptic knobs. So this is described as the bipolar neuron. It has a dendrite that feeds into the soma, which then feeds into the axon. So that's how you see that shape. And let me go back to the multipolar motor neuron, and let's label, you have several dendrites, you have your soma or cell body, and you have a single axon. Now the axon can branch. So the axon can branch and branch, but there's just considered to be one axon. Going back to your bipolar neuron, we're going to see these, remember, in sensory structures such as the olfactory epithelium. This is our sense of smell, and our retina, which is part of our eye and our vision. And then sensory neuron, these are going to be throughout the afferent division. Here we have the unipolar shape. So in this case, draw your dendrite and your axon as basically one line. And then to the side of all that, draw in your cell body. So you have a dendrite here becoming continuous with the axon. And then the soma is to the side. And this is your sensory and your unipolar neuron. All right, stay tuned. Next up are the glial cells. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.